Afternoon. It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Dr. Megha Pruthi. She's one of the most upcoming, upcoming persons or upcoming faculty in the field of palliative medicine. And she's MBBS, MD, and DNB, and MSc Palliative Medicine from Cardiff University, with a fellowship in pain medicine also. She has been a reviewer for the Indian Journal of Palliative Care. She's a member of the expert committee for integrating palliative care in undergraduate medical education in India. She's also a contributor and a peer reviewer for the BMJ Group of India Palliative Medicine Learning Modules. And she is also the recipient of the APHN or Asia Pacific Hospice Network bursary for the 14th Asia Pacific Hospice Palliative Care Conference in 2021. She has authored and co-authored a number of peer-reviewed journals and in international and national forums. And the list is actually endless. I welcome Dr. Megha to take this very important session on delirium. Dr. Megha, over to you. And we are all eager to learn from you.
Hello, Dr. Sanghmitra. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Megha. How are you?
I'm good. Long time, huh?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this generously kind introduction, Dr. Bora. And it's, in fact, a pleasure to be here and be associated with you all and Pallium and contribute our bit to, just spread the awareness and the right things about palliative medicine. It's always an honor to do any of such thing. I would just share my slides. Give me a moment. I hope you all can see my slides, isn't it?
Visible, but not in presentation mode.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, now it's in presentation mode, isn't it? Everybody can see. Super. So thank you so much, everyone, and welcome all. On behalf of ECO and Pallium India, I'm Dr. Megha, and I am working as a senior consultant pain and palliative medicine in the Department of Oncology in Max Institute of Cancer Care, Max Super Specialty Hospital, Vaishali, Delhi, NCR. And today we are discussing a very, very important topic, which is delirium, right? So I would say I'm not really, so it's actually a neuropsychiatric, neurocognitive thing, symptom or entity, and any neurologist or mostly together would be the best persons to, are experts at it. However, we palliative medicine deal with a lot of delirium, and we will be discussing majorly delirium in perspective of palliative medicine, right? So delirium is actually derived from a Latin term, which means delirare. That means to go out of the furrow, off the track, So many times this is also our colleagues, peers also say in this altered sensorium or in psychosis. So this is very difficult, many times mixed up with a lot of other things, right? That is why it is a lot misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed thing. So I'll just give you a few examples. I mean, we're not going into these cases in detail, just a little bit how all delirium presents, A 55-year-old male, chronic alcoholic and liver failure, admitted with hematemesis. In the ward, he shouts, abuses, becomes restless, pulls out his IV line. So he's delirious. A 60-year-old lady, a known diabetic on insulin, found in a state of lethargy. This is delirium. 40-year-old lady with carcinoma breast, post-surgery, ongoing chemo. One fine morning, she's found in a state of disorientations. There are a lot of lions in the room staring at her. This is delirium. So it's more neuropsychiatric symptom, as I already mentioned, right? So let us go into first, before we actually this part I actually took it from one of the really nice lectures that I heard lately about delirium with Dr. Naveen Salins, and he has given this analogy. So before we move on to delirium, first let us know what is consciousness, right? Which is kind of opposite to delirium. So what is consciousness? One thing is awakeness, that you're awake, that when you are listening to me, when your eyes are open, you're trying to listen to me, or you have come up to this, you've joined this lecture, you're awake, right? Next is alertness, right? So you are alert and trying to comprehend what I'm telling you. So you're alert, awakeness, alertness, and awareness. When you actually are able to understand and comprehend what I'm saying, that means you're aware of your surroundings. So awakeness, alertness, and awareness. So these three things will keep on coming somewhere or the other as we go through the lecture, right? So just to mention, you guys can stop me in between. If at all you have anything that you do not understand, you can always stop me. Right? So cognition. First we understood what is consciousness. Now what is cognition? Cognition is the internal structures and the processes that are involved in acquisition and use of knowledge, including sensation, perception, attention, learning, memory, language, thinking, and reasoning, right? So this is consciousness, this is cognition. When things are impaired, what happens is delirium. So what is delirium? It is characterized by acute change, important, acute change in cognition, disturbance in consciousness, usually resulting from underlying medical condition or from medication or drug withdrawal. Okay, so what are the important things are acute, delirium is always acute onset. Okay, remember acute onset and change in cognition and consciousness, second thing. Third is there is always an underlying cause, okay, underlying medical condition, there is some medication or some drug withdrawal. Three things, acute change in cognition, consciousness, and underlying cause, right? So these three things are really important. Approximately, it is very important for all of us to know because 80% of cancer patients have delirium near death, right? And the percentages vary from 0 to 90% in the patients who will have delirium. In fact, since delirium is more precipitated by unexposed or new surroundings or environment, so they say it's less than 1% when the patient is at home, 30% when the patient is hospitalized, and increases to 60% when the patients are in ICU. And everybody has heard about ICU psychosis. And so 0, 30, 60. So this is just an average or a rough estimate, right? And delirium is an indicator of poor prognosis also. In fact, the prognostic scales, they were studied that delirium should be a part of it, and it increases the sensitivity if there is, when the patients are near at end of life, it increases the sensitivity of the prognostic scales. Right, and it is, of course, it is an indicator of end of life when dealing in palliative care. Is it only in cancer patients? Of course not. It is, as I told you, 10 to 20% of all hospitalized adults, 30 to 40% of elderly hospitalized patients, and 80% of ICU patients, right? So as I told you, the 3-4 things that are important in delirium. So there, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, has given this. There are 5 basically diagnostic criteria. I mean, there are 5 things that are important. Okay, First is a disturbance in attention, right? The patient is not able to pay attention and awareness. Attention and awareness, that is reduced ability to direct focus, sustain, or shift attention, right? And awareness, reduced orientation to the environment. Again, the same thing, that the patient is not aware or not attentive enough. So this is about, first point is on consciousness. Second is acute onset, develops over a short period of time, usually hours to days, and represents a change from baseline attention and awareness, and tends to fluctuate during the day also. Like it's mostly more in the evenings than in the daytime. So acute onset and consciousness. Third is cognition, additional disturbance in cognition, like memory deficit, the patients get disoriented, language, visual, spatial inability to perceive that. So cognition, third is cognition. Fourth criteria is that the disturbances, criteria 1 and 2, are not better explained by any pre-existing or neurocognitive disorders, and do not occur in context of severely reduced level of arousal, like coma. If it's coma, it's an entirely different thing. So all these are not explained by any pre-existing thing. And the fifth is that the other important thing, that there is always an underlying cause, right? So if we remember 3 things about delirium: acute onset, changes in consciousness and cognition, and third is underlying problem, right? So these 3 things are really important, and these are also summarized in the 5 diagnostic criteria for delirium in DSM-5. So there is always an evidence from the history or physical examination or the lab findings that the disturbance is a direct physiological consequence of another medical condition, like substance intoxication or withdrawal, exposure to a toxin, or it can be sometimes multiple etiologies, right? It is an acute confusional state with mental clouding, poor concentration, impairment of short-term memory, disorientation, misinterpretations, paranoid delusions, can have hallucinations, agitation, incoherent speech, aggressive behavior. So anything, this kind of is a spectrum where the delirium varies, right? And however, we can actually classify delirium into 3 major things, right? First is hyperactive, when the patients present with psychomotor agitation, increased arousal and delusions, and the degree of cognitive impairment may be variable or even minimal, right? There's more of agitation there. Next is hypoactive, when the features of this type of delirium include withdrawal, lethargy, and decreased arousal. And there can very well be a mixed delirium which presents with both the features, and this can happen, this can really happen, right? So since it is so, it is similar to many things, that's why it is often unrecognized, or it goes misdiagnosed and is mistaken for things like dementia or depression or mania or acute schizophrenic reaction, or just as a part of old age. You know, they say that the patient is very old, he doesn't understand. So they are mostly mistaken for these things. So how do we differentiate? In clinically, when we are doing our rounds or working in our OPD or IPD, how do we differentiate? It's pretty simple. So delirium, again, 3 things, as I told you, there will be fluctuating levels of consciousness with decreased attention, like it's an acute onset, disorientation, visual hallucinations, so cognition is impaired, consciousness is impaired, and acute onset, right? And it also fluctuates during the day, right? Most of the cases will remit with correction of underlying medical condition, because delirium always has an underlying medical condition. Then dementia, however, is a chronic, slow onset and progressive thing with memory impairment. It can lead to disorientation and agitation too in later stages, but mostly it is memory impairment, and it's chronic and slow onset. It keeps on increasing. Depression, however, is sadness, loss of interest, pleasure in usual activities, and disturbance of sleep, appetite, concentration, and energy, feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, thoughts of suicide, and single or episode or multiple episodes, and it may be chronic. So looks like on the first front that depression and hypoactive delirium are very similar, isn't it? In hypoactive delirium also some similar things will be happening. The patient will be sad, kind of withdrawn and those things. However, how do we differentiate? By asking just a few orientation questions. I think last time when I was taking this lecture, Dr. Sri even mentioned one of her experiences of hypoactive delirium, where she said that they were all thinking about a patient. They were all thinking that he's too depressed. And when Dr. Rajgopal came in for rounds and he just asked a few questions, where is he? And then they got to know that the patient was not really oriented to the place they were, to the time. So that is how simple questions, like, so they help us to differentiate between depression and hypoactive delirium. Psychotic disorders, in terms of there are deficits in reality testing. Usually they're slow onset and prodromal, with the prodrome always, mostly. And they are usually chronic, again with exacerbation. Okay, the patient will be normal and then there will be some days of exacerbation. So psychotic disorders are mostly chronic. They are not acute onset. Why are we reading, or why are we trying to talk about delirium anyways, right? So because it is so important. For the family, for the staff. Patients, of course, look, one day the patient is all conscious oriented, telling you about your pain, about his pain, that he did not sleep well last night, he doesn't like the food that is being served here in the hospital. The other day they are just not able to tell what they are going through, isn't it? So there is interference in the communication. They are not able to tell about their symptoms. And of course, this kind of leads to more of investigations and increased interventions too, right? So we will definitely do some investigation. So there are implications of delirium. So a patient is not able to participate in the decision-making. Assessment of other symptoms becomes difficult, as I told you, and interferes with communication between the patient and the family. The family really, this affects family a lot because they are kind of losing the person that they love, they had, right? The person is not the same person that he initially was. So they are not able to communicate and they become really scared when the patient acts like that and they think that the patient is going mad. So it's very important to communicate with the family like that. We'll come to the management, of course. Then families find changes in the mental status of the relative very distressing, of course, and difficulty in interpreting the symptoms, conflicts with the relatives, increases the stress. Okay. So yeah, these are the implications on the patient, family, and of course the hospital staff too. So what are the risk factors? Why is it important to know the risk factors? Of course, so that we can pay more attention to such people and prevent the happening of delirium, isn't it? So risk factors are old age, male sex has been found to be statistically more significant, then hypoxia, dehydration, cachexia, opioid use, anticholinergic burden as in the number of drugs that are anticholinergic drugs that the patient is on, and ECOG performance status, right? But there are also other factors, other drugs that can be a risk factor. But these are important risk factors. So elderly patients, and so in all these patients, we can be, obviously in elderly, we are always more careful while we're using steroids. We're more careful while you're using opioids. We're more careful while we're using these anticholinergic drugs like amitriptyline, nortriptyline, isn't it? So that's because these can really precipitate delirium in such patients. So what are the precipitating factors? These were the risk factors and the precipitating factors. Change of environment, the patient goes from home to hospital, change in environment, higher chances. From ward to ICU, double the chances of delirium, because they do not see familiar faces. There are alarms buzzing throughout the day. There is no morning and night in the ICU. So change in environment, unfamiliar stimuli. too hot, too cold, wet bed, creases in the sheets. So we in palliative care are very, very particular about all these things, that the patient has to be in a comfortable environment, comfortable position, the room should not be very hot, should not be very cold, daily changing of the linen of the bed, there should be no creases, cleanly keeping the patient, daily cleaning, bathing, and these things are very important. Right. So what are the causes? I've been emphasizing that there's always an underlying cause. What can be the causes? Fecal impaction, as simple thing as constipation. If we forget to ask the patient, has he passed feces or not? Simple thing as that can lead to delirium. Pain can lead to delirium. Urinary retention can lead to delirium. Infections can, dehydration can, brain tumors, of course, that's the organic cause of delirium. There can be hypercalcemia, hyponatremia, drug-induced like opioids, corticosteroids, anticholinergics, as I already mentioned. These three are very important drugs that can lead to, and mostly our palliative care patients are on one or two of these medications. Even some of the chemotherapeutic agents like cisplatin, 5-FU, and methotrexate can lead to delirium. And of course, as we mentioned, the withdrawal state, the patient who's a chronic alcoholic or a nicotine smoker or on psychotropic drugs, if they are suddenly withdrawn, they can lead to delirium, thiamine deficiency. So delirium is frequently underdiagnosed. Why? Because we are not really screening for it. Do we just like, we take the vitals daily, isn't it, to know the cardiopulmonary status? Do we also, we have to know the brain status too, isn't it? In ICU, they always measure the GCS, Glasgow Coma Scale. So it's important for us to know the brain status too. So we have some delirium assessment tools. There are many actually. They say there is, I was just going through a few of the literature on delirium recently. And so there's one single question which has 80% sensitivity, right? A simple screening question like to the relatives or the friends or the caregivers of the patient. Do you think, if we as the health professionals ask them, do you think the patient, Mr. X, is confused of late or remains confused? So a simple question like that, if the caregivers say yes, so a simple question like that can have 80% sensitivity to know that the patient is probably getting delirious or getting into delirium, so that we can, early start managing and looking for a cause. So, however, there are other things like confusion assessment measurement and delirium rating scales and mini mental status examination, or MDAS, or Memorial Delirium Assessment Scale. So these are, I'm just discussing two of these, and there are many simple things that we can use in our daily practice. Mini mental state examination, I'm sure we all have seen it sometime or the other. It's a 30-point scale, right? And just a little thing about it. So 5 points for orientation to the time orientation, 5 points, place orientation, 5 points, registration of 3 words. Let me tell you how do we do it. I'm sure many of you would know it, but we ask 5 questions related to time orientation, like year, season, month, date, and time, right? And then give the score, how many are correct. So the patient gets a score like that. Then the place orientation. Kindly excuse me. So place orientation, we ask about the country, town, district, hospital, ward of law. Again, out of 5, give them the marks that they get right. Then registration, okay, so name the 3 objects and ask them to repeat, right? So maybe they're able to repeat, out of 3, they get the marks. Attention and calculation, ask them to say, subtract 7 from 100 and then repeat. Like continue for 5 times, 100 minus 7, 93 minus 7, 86 minus 7, 79. So like that, if they're able to do it 5 times, how many are correct out of 5? Do that. Recall the 3 things, the 3 objects that you said earlier. So let them tell the 3 objects. If they're able to tell, great. The score out of 3. The language, name name the 2 objects. They need to tell you any 2 objects. Repeat and repeat them. Then give a 3-stage command. 3-stage command, like here as an example is there. Place index finger of the right hand on your nose and then on your left ear. Right. So 3-stage command, jitna the stages that they're able to do, they get a score out of 3. Then another would be written reading. Yeah, ask the patient to read and then obey the command. Ask the patient to write a sentence. A sentence is legible or not. The sentence should have a subject and the verb. And third, the last thing is copying. Right. So out of 30, you give a score. If the score is 24 to 30, there's no cognitive impairment. 18 to 23 is mild, and 0 to 17 is severe cognitive impairment, right? So MMSE is a simple thing. We can do that. MDAS is another scale. So basically, we are examining the same things in all the scales. This is Memorial Delirium Assessment Scale. There are a total of 10 items that we need to assess here. And so every item gets a kind of, you need to score every item on a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3. Depends. 0 means normal, 3 means impaired. So a reduced level of consciousness. So here in item 1, we are assessing the awareness. Rate the patient's current awareness and awareness of an interaction with the environment, interviewer, people, objects in the room, right? So you can just tell the patient, ask the patient to describe your environment. How much is the patient? 0 means normal. The patient is fully aware. 1 is mild impairment, like the patient is aware of unaware of some elements. However, the patient is able to interact, tell about things when you are prodding the patient strongly. The patient is able to tell. 2 is moderate, unaware of some or all the elements and not spontaneously interacting. So here the interview becomes prolonged, but is not seriously disrupted. The interviewer, we are still able to ask them. And 3 is severe impairment, when the patient is absolutely not aware and of any interaction, of any things that are happening around them. And then mostly the interview is not really possible. Right, then the item 2 is disorientation. The first item, we measured the awareness, then the orientation. Again, similar to MMSE, 10 orientation items are there: time and date, time and day, so and place, time and place, date, month, 10 things, and then score them on the basis of how many they are telling correct: 0, 1, 2, 3. Then short-term memory impairment, again, similar to that, repetition and delayed recall of 3 words. Just tell them 3 words, tell them to repeat right now, and then after 5 minutes. And again, score them on the basis of how many they are able to tell: 0, 1, 2, 3. Item 4 is impaired digit span. So to repeat 3, 4, and then 5 digits forwards and then backwards. So you say 719. And then they have to, that's a 3-digit span. So they have to tell you, repeat after you, 719. And similarly, you know, then the 4 digits and the 5 digits, and then backwards. So if you say 719, they need to say 917. Okay, so instructions have to be given very properly, and you need to, you know, give them examples before you actually start doing the exam here in a digit span here. Again, 0, 1, 2, 3, if there is no impairment, mild, moderate, or severe impairment. Then item 5 is reduced ability to maintain and shift attention. This is more of an observation thing. Then we need to rephrase the questions, we need to repeat the questions. Patient's attention wanders and he loses track again. So this, while we are conducting this interview, we are just observing these things, and then we'll rate it on a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3. Then disorganized thinking, that the patient rambles in between, becomes incoherent, becomes irrelevant, tangential, circumstantial, or faulty reasoning. So disoriented, disorganized thinking. So you can ask them to, describe your current medical condition. If they're able to do that, 0, 1, 2, 3. In perceptual disturbances, there are misperceptions, illusions, hallucination, inappropriate behavior. Again, we are just observing these things and rating them on a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3. Delusions, inappropriate behavior during interview or admitted by the patient. Again, we are observing this 0, 1, 2, 3. Decreased or increased psychomotor activity, hypoactive, hyperactive, or elements of both are present. Okay, 0, 1, 2, 3. Then 10th is sleep-wake cycle disturbance or disorder of arousal, where the nurses, family, or the patients, they use their charts and observe how they have been sleeping. Okay, so a total of 10 items. Every item has a maximum of 3 score. So 30 is the total score. 13 out of 30 is the cutoff point. So just a recapitulation of this, how to do it. So for M dash, ask the orientation in time, place, and person, short-term memory, digit span, hallucinations and illusions, delusions, hyper or hypoactive the patient is, how has the sleep been, and observe the level of consciousness, disorganized thinking, focus, sustain or shift attention. Right, so this is M dash. So over to management now. Management, so we are actually reading all this, everything to manage it, isn't it? So management is, in a way, it's not very easy because it's not really just the one medication that is going to help a patient who's in delirium. So first, foremost thing is correct the correctable. As I said, it is most of the times we will be able to find some cause to it. So correct the correctable, very important, right? And non-drug treatment, only the, give me one moment, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Correct the correctable, right? Very important, and non-drug treatment, very, very important. Drug treatments are also important, but the role in there's a limited role of drug treatment. We will come to that. Correct the correctable and non-drug. Okay, so first of all, find the cause, right? The causes that we already discussed is if there is fecal impaction, there's pain, urinary retention, infection, dehydration, brain tumors, any electrolyte disturbances, if there are opioids being used, and if the patient doesn't seem to be in pain, we can use behavioral scales for that and reduce opioids accordingly, steroids and anticholinergics, like amitriptyline or nortriptyline. These are important drugs or other chemotherapeutic agents. Find the cause and correct it. Withdrawal state, if the patient is in, thiamine deficiency, all these. Non-drug management, utterly important for delirium. This is also important, in the patients who are at risk of delirium. It's important to start with non-drug management with them, and it actually prevents the delirium. So tell the patient and family that delirium is not madness. Importantly, like what we do in our hospital is that we have actually, taken classes for nurses to do simple things, especially the ICU nurses here. We tell them about orientation protocols, right? Since they are majorly taking care of 1 or 2 patients. So we tell them about orientation protocols. While you are just putting the IV fluid on, so tell the patient that I am nurse this and that, I am nurse Megha, and I will be taking care of you from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. Now, right now, the time is 2 p.m. of the afternoon. You are Mr. So-and-so, and we this time is this medication I'm giving you for your pain. So just telling them about what time is it, date is it, and what part of day is it, what they are trying to do to them. So nurses can play a huge role, immense role in non-drug management. We just need to train them. They do not need to provide more time to the patient, but just utilize that time, while they are doing things around them, while they're cleaning them up, doing anything. So if they just make a dialogue with the patient, I think that really helps. And in our ICU, beds need to be positioned, especially the patients who are chronically there. So the beds are towards the sunlight, and especially the sun, they are so that they're able to see the sun in the morning, and then lights of course dim in at the night. However, still there is a lot of alarms and those things that keep buzzing in the ICU. The ICU is always moving. So yeah, that's why it's a precipitating factor, and there are higher incidence of delirium there in ICU. However, still non-drug treatments work really well. Okay, so yeah, about the caregivers, tell them that this is not madness. This is because of this reason, and we are trying to correct it, isn't it? Continue to treat the patient with courtesy and respect. Once the patient is delirious, do not think that okay, unko kuch samajh mein nahi aa raha hai, right? Always involve him into the assessment and talk to him. Okay, we are trying to we can see that you are upset and you do not feel very well, and tell them what you're going to do while you're putting a cannula. There'll just be a little break. I'm trying to give you some medication, and no physical restraints, despite my any efforts that you might do. In ICUs, we still see physical restraints, which are absolutely not allowed anytime in palliative medicine. If at all, we can use chemical restraints, but no physical restraints. Patients should be allowed to walk, but obviously accompanied. And explain every procedure, event in detail, presence of family member, close friend. Doctors can acknowledge the patient's distress. Right, environmental modifications, reorientation techniques, memory cues, like you can put a calendar, clock, family photos in the wardroom, or if the patient is at home, so you can do that. Environment should be stable, quiet, well lighted, support from a familiar nurse. The nurse, mostly the patients who are chronic, they become very comfortable with one nurse. So appointing the same nurse every time the patient comes in the hospital should be encouraged. Family members and staff should explain the proceedings at every opportunity, reinforce orientation, and reassure the patient, right? Very, very important. You cannot decrease the importance of this thing, considering ki hum kuch medicine de rahe. No. Always keep thinking about how we can, at every point, we must try and reorient the patient. Sensory deficits, if the patient uses glasses or any hearing aid, so it's a must, especially in ICU. We always encourage all our patients to have their glasses, to have their hearing aids, so that they're able to communicate and see for themselves. Then over to drug treatment, there are some neuroleptic drugs, antipsychotic drugs that are useful in such situations because these are very distressing situations, and using just the non-drug treatments or correcting the correctables takes a little bit of time for the things to get better. So sometimes we do resort to drug treatments. Most commonly used neuroleptic is haloperidol. We can use it 1.5 to 3 milligram orally 8th hourly, or it can be used subcutaneous or IV. It can even be given continuous IV infusion. And however, it can cause QT prolongation. So must to take a history about any cardiac issues or get an ECG done, right? So risperidone, quetiapine, olanzapine, all these drugs we use for delirium. Most important is review, right? So the changes that you have done for the correctables, review those. And reviewing, I think it's really important for us to understand that it is not going to go in one day, isn't it? Delirium, when it happens, it is there, and we need to correct the correctable causes, keep orienting the patient while we are also giving the medications, right? So review the patient daily. So to summarize, this is underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed, so screen for it. Poor prognosis, it is a harbinger for a poor prognosis and short lifespan. Correct the correctable, non-drug treatment and drug treatment, as we discussed. Thank you very much. Any questions? Should I stop sharing, Dr. Mitra? Dr. Bora?
Yeah, I think it's, I think you can just have your presentation stand by, and then If anybody wants to
Stop,
have a
sorry.
review.
Please go ahead.
If anybody wants to refer to one of your slides, you know.
Okay, I'll share again if at all required, no problem.
That would be a good thing.
Oh, can we see as the servants of sleep will be there?
So
what is the importance of scoring? Somebody's asking.
Yes, Usha Raghavan, she's actually asked about the ECOG score and then this question. Yeah, Megha.
So ECOG is majorly a performance status, okay? ECOG is Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. They have given a performance status. So ECOG is widely used in oncology, and we base our decisions on even chemotherapies or surgeries based on ECOG. The ECOG performance status is so it ranges from 0 to 5, okay? 0 is normal and 5 is dead. In between, if the patient is able to carry out his daily routines and the regular works, is 1. 2 is that the patient is, for 25% of the time, the patient is on bed and majorly able to carry out their works on their own. 3 is that they need assistance even in the regular course. And 4 is that when the patient is severely impaired, right? Most of the times he's bedridden. So that's ECOG performance status.
So Dr.
I think she also needs.
Yeah, please.
So I think she is asking what's the importance of scoring. Is it the scoring of MDAS that you're asking, Dr. Usha? Okay, I'll still answer that. So it's important to know how, so mild, moderate, and severe, that is how we are scoring delirium, isn't it? And it's important because our management will depend on that. If it is severe delirium, I think we need to resort to drug treatments then. And otherwise we can, start with, if it's only mild delirium, we can start with non-drug treatments and correct the correctables alone while we are, telling and communicating with the family and the caregivers appropriately.
So there's another question from Dr. I think, yes, sorry, Dr. Dr. Jagdish.
Yeah.
So here's a
How
question. How much do we investigate?
Yeah, so Dr. Jagdish, I think it is important. So, but it is also important, and when we talk of delirium in palliative care, it is also important what are the goals of care, right? So if the patient is in a terminal phase or impending dying, impending death, then we may or may not investigate. However, if the patient has been okay and was doing well, suddenly develops delirium, it is important to investigate the causes in terms of the electrolyte disturbances and those things. How much do we investigate will depend on the goals of care at that point for the patient. If it is end of life care, we may not investigate a lot, and but simple things like if there is constipation or urinary retention or pain, and these things are the precipitating causes, or any withdrawal of the drugs or the opioids or those things, we need to take care of that. Did I answer your question, Dr. Jagdish, or would you like to ask? You can unmute yourself and ask
yes.
If you for the clarification.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What I was trying to to ask is, sometimes we cannot be sure about the cause of delirium only by evaluation, by clinical evaluation, yes. Especially in a patient who is non-terminal. Yes, in the terminal delirium, that's a different issue altogether. But our sometimes maybe we hang on to some kind of a diagnosis and then it turns out to be wrong. Because I've had a very interesting situation where one of these senior citizens who was on palliative care was assumed to have nothing at all, and when they did a scan, they found that he had a subdural hematoma due to some issue there. So I think the problem is sometimes to get to an etiology. Of course, if there are localizing signs, of course you'll investigate, but otherwise it is a challenge.
it is important to investigate, especially say if a cancer patient has suddenly become delirious. So it's important to get a CT scan of head done or an MRI brain done to rule out any brain metastasis, because brain metastasis patients can have a good lifespan with a whole brain RT, or when there are leptomeningeal mets, even that can lead to delirium. So we need to evaluate these things. Intrathecal methotrexate and those things are important to be given in such things, and it's important to investigate. Definitely, I would not say that if just because the patient is for palliation, we should not investigate delirium. Delirium always has an underlying cause. We need to find the cause and correct the correctable, as I am emphasizing already, that it's important to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Dr. Megha, another important question. I think this is going to create some more ripples. Can we use haloperidol in terminal cancer patients?
Yes, we can use. What we do in our regular practice is we do get a baseline ECG done, just to rule out that if there are QT prolongations, haloperidol can cause that. But in terminal cancer patients, yes, haloperidol is the most commonly used neuroleptic, and we can use it. Start in lower doses. So you can even start with 1 milligram or even 0.5 milligram if the patient is too frail. So you can start with as low as 0.5 milligram, go up to 1 milligram, start mostly at night and increase it to twice a day. And haloperidol is definitely useful, can be used.
Yeah. So in continuation to that question, Dr. Praveen is asking about what drugs apart from haloperidol can be used.
So in ICU, if the patient is able to take orally, quetiapine is a good drug. Now, you can start with 12.5 milligram HS or 25 milligram HS or 12.5 D twice a day. So, but that's only available in oral form. So if the patient is take orally or has a Ryle's tube, you can use quetiapine. Quetiapine has less cardiac effects, and it also induces sleep. It causes more sleepiness. So all the more if the patient is in hyperactive delirium and sleep is an issue for the patient, quetiapine is a good drug.
And Dr. Megha, I don't know whether you have had this experience, but I have tried quetiapine, giving it sublingually also.
Okay.
There is an absorption of sublingual quetiapine. So I don't know. Do you recommend giving it sublingually? If the patient is
I mean, you just crush it, make it paste, and keep it sublingually.
Yes,
is it?
Yes, right.
Okay,
that's right.
No, I've never used it.
Okay.
I have not really read about it. Have you read about it, or you just started using? I mean, we in palliative care do things to suit our stuff sometimes.
I seriously have not read about it, but this has been through from these kind of seniors that I have met and the mentors who usually try out certain methods of doing it. So that's how I started. I mean,
I don't know. It might work. There's no harm.
Yeah. Sure. So what I was told is that when you use it orally, the patient is swallowing it. So when the patient is unable to swallow it, why not keep it under the tongue to get some absorption? So that was the whole thing about it.
Okay.
So, anyway, okay. So yes. Dr. Babita.
Dr. Babita is asking, drugs used in terminal delirium are midazolam and lorazepam. If they fail, use barbiturates and propofol. Okay. So Dr. Babita, so midazolam and lorazepam, or for that matter, any benzodiazepines, they are not used in delirium. In fact, if given to a delirious patient, they might aggravate delirium. Okay, so midazolam and lorazepam are majorly given as anti-anxiety agents or just to induce sleep. Sometimes we can use them, but not for delirium. We sometimes add on to haloperidol some midazolam just to decrease the hyperactive behavior. But I think first line of drug is definitely haloperidol or neuroleptics, not midazolam and lorazepam. Talking about these terminal, give me a second. Hello. Sorry. Yeah. So terminal delirium, when you say, so that those will be a very refractory delirium, that but we will use them for palliative sedation, not for delirium per se. When we have actually used enough of haloperidol and we are not getting, the patient is still restless and hyperactive, only then we can use midazolam. And so that's for palliative sedation. Things will be midazolam, then barbiturates and propofol. So that is more for palliative sedation that we use. Do you agree, Dr. Bora?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree.
Yeah, so Dr. Babita also says haloperidol and chlorpromazine are used in reversible delirium. Yeah, chlorpromazine, it's not really chlorpromazine. Again, chlorpromazine is more of, sedative than to be used in delirium. Chlorpromazine not really. Chlorpromazine, if I'm not mistaken, it's an antihistaminic, an old kind of antihistaminic, isn't it?
Yes.
Anna, so no, not
really not use chlorpromazine.
Okay, Dr. Sujata is asking, how do we sensitize young doctors and nurses regarding having to continue to treat patients with dignity and respect and avoiding physical restraints or constraints? All the documentation and basic training tells us this. ICU teams at various hospitals still continue to. I can so understand. I have started palliative medicine in 3 of the corporate hospitals. I've been working in this hospital for the last 2.5 years. I keep banging my head with them to do all this. The only thing is persistence. The only thing that will work out is keep doing it, keep telling them. I would say I think those who are going through that phase, we have to be persistent. We have to show them that this works. And removing, I mean, nurses go alag se, we need to take classes for them about orientation protocols, about use of chemical restraints, about not using physical restraints. Dr. Sujata, I can so understand because I still keep seeing, even while I'm there in the hospital, I still see my patients being physically restrained, and it's an ongoing process. We all are there together in it and trying to do our best.
Can I just take one minute and then share something very funny that happened with me very recently? Actually, I'm working for this cancer organization, which is a very new organization in Assam. And we are actually coming up with 18 cancer hospitals. It's a kind of a tie-up between Tata Trusts and Government of Assam. So it's a kind of a high visible program that is right now going on in the state. And we don't have our hospitals right now. They are all under construction, and we are like, trying to make up SOPs and kind of protocols, training our nurses and doctors. So interestingly, I am being asked to make the SOPs for palliative care. And very recently, I started making the SOPs, and I'm being supervised kind of by the CEO, who's actually a kind of he has been a doctor, but then he has never practiced clinically. He's always been a management person. So he saw my SOP, and then he said, "Arey, ICU, you have not put in this that you have to put constraints with patients who are delirious." So I had to, kind of almost go and fight with him every day not to include that particular as an SOP. I mean, you can actually understand the frustration that people have, that palliative care physicians generally have, because you actually need to get inside the system, have some perseverance, develop a lot of patience, and then make them understand that yes, it is actually possible for us to take care of delirium even without restraining our patients, So I can relate to what Dr. Sujata is actually telling me right now. I hope it doesn't, this thing does not actually is inside the SOP of an ICU, where you will need to follow that patients will have to be restrained once they are delirious. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, agree. So Dr. Sanjay Pandya says, how do we differentiate organic brain involvement and delirium? Any clinical indicators like plantar reflex or anything else? So I think, planters are organic brain involvement. So, I mean, clinically, how do we differentiate? I am not really sure about how the plantar reflexes go. I do not remember that, frankly, right now. Or anything else.
You see, delirium is more of a kind of a symptom related or to say the expression related thing of a patient. And very often we generally depend on our clinical skills to diagnose delirium. Dr. Megha, am I?
Yeah, you're right. No, what he's asking is organic brain involvement and delirium. So
Exactly.
can we really
Can
Dr. Sanjay, please go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Sanjay.
Yeah. Actually, what happens that when there is a confused state or a altered behavior or something is there, usually clinicians go for a CT scan or brain or something like costly investigation. So just wanted to know any clinical criteria which can differentiate between any brain involvement like infection in the brain or some strokes, some stroke is going on in the midbrain or something. So some organic disease is something different. Delirium is a secondary disease, what I understood. Because of underlying some disease or something, a cognitive behavior
I got
change,
your
which is a reversible always.
Mostly it's the frankly I do not remember about the.
I personally feel that maybe what we have said to do when we need to find out that the particular person is having delirium or not, or because of his organic nature or some other nature, then in that case, what we need to do is firstly the initial things which you have listed in that. What are the underlying factors which first we have to rule out those underlying factors which can be there, which can lead to delirium. And then we need to basically see the organic cause. What can be the organic cause? There are certain basic investigations we can just do, and maybe then later on we can go for a CT scan on a later stage. Initially, we have to work on the patient initially.
Usually, what happens is clinician usually immediately orders costly investigation.
We do order
so
a
just
CT
to
scan
avoid.
Sometimes early on in there. Majorly that the decision to order a CT scan is majorly for when we suspect especially say cancer, and we suspect that there can be brain metastasis, cancer that is more susceptible and more when there are chances for brain metastasis, we can order in a brain scan early on in the investigations too.
So,
just wanted to know any clinical parameter which can prevent us to ordering these things.
There would be some, but I am not really sure of them right now. There would be some. If there is any neurologist here in between Sanjay, us, they may answer that for us.
Yeah.
Dr. Sanjay, if I may add, I mean, if I were to manage a patient like this, I would generally want to control the delirium first and then investigate on the organic causes, because you need to control the delirium first, calm down the patient, and then actually go for an investigation. I think that would be a right approach too.
Yes, that's true, madam. But what I feel is just to avoid, because most of the time MRI turns out to be normal in such cases.
No, I think at
So,
that
so
point
it
of
is a
time,
unnecessary.
we'll need
So
to
it is a,
discuss.
yeah.
Yeah, you'll need to discuss these things, and as we are.
So let us just close this thing by saying that look, whenever we suspect of such a thing, delirium is always managed by a team. In our setup also, we involve a neurologist whenever required. So I think having a neurologist comment on that would be a better thing to do, and involve a neurologist to see if we can differentiate on a clinical exam or not.
Okay, thank you, madam.
Yes. Okay. How early can we see delirium in ICU patients? Oh, Dr. Nadesh, it can be as early as 1 day when the patients are in ICU, elderly patient, sometimes even with electrolyte disturbances, delirium can be present the same day, day 0 also. It can be as early as that. Then Dr. Babita says ASCO palliative care guidelines recommend chlorpromazine. Maybe Dr. Babita, I am not really aware of this drug chlorpromazine being used in reversible delirium. So I'm sure you're right on that. I need to get back to you after reading. So keep on trying. Dr. Ujwal says a national level oral surgeon, smile trained director in delirium physical restraints due to delirium for 3 months in ICU on and off. Things like this do happen, and it is very difficult to see it happening. This disrespect for feelings. I can so understand how everyone feels on that. Anybody else who wants to unmute and ask any questions, they are more than welcome, please. Else we'll start with the case presentation. We have the case presentation, isn't it?
No, we don't. Shripriya, do we have a case presentation?
Ma'am, today we are not going for any case presentation.
Okay.
So the time is here still 4:30, Dr. Megha.
Okay, no problem. Any questions, any discussion anybody wants, more than welcome. Otherwise, yeah. Can we then close the session? What do you say, Dr. Bora?
Yeah, if they don't have any questions, then I think we can actually go for closing this session, because yes, just 4. But if anybody wants to discuss anything, any of their experiences regarding taking care of a delirious patient in ICU or in the ward, you're most welcome to discuss that. We'll take that as a case presentation for today. Any experience? Dr. Sujata, you want to discuss a case that you've recently seen? I think no. So Shri, can we actually close this session for everyone?
Yes, ma'am. If it is okay with everyone, I think maybe we should give them at least half an hour break
please.
for at least one session.
Yeah, please.
Please, can I?
Yes, who is this?
I think it was Dr. Ujjwal.
Ma'am, please.
Yes, Dr.
This is
Ujjwal.
Ujjwal.
Please,
Please, can I speak?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, Dr.
Hello.
Ujjwal, you are audible. Please continue.
Speak, ma'am. Ma'am, 45-year-old person reported to the complaint of suddenly urination had stopped at night 2 a.m. and with that chief complaint in the morning 9 o'clock When he started from his home, he was absolutely normal. On the way, within 20 minutes, he developed severe delirium and he was unable to comprehend even where he is going. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are audible. Please go ahead.
Within 20 minutes, he was unaware of where he is going. He had gone into that state of delirium. And after he reported to the hospital, his BP was not recordable. And for that reason, he was shifted immediately into the ICU. And the immediate blood investigations were done. The creatinine level was 6.8. There was severe urinary retention. The cause for the acute renal failure was not being able to diagnose. But then, as the intensivist was a very good physician of an all India level, he's got the best doctor award even in the Southeast. So he was able to diagnose there is some underlying cause like septicemia. The patient's family had an history of pancreatic cancer, a very strong history of cancer. His aunt had deceased to cancer. His grandfather had lost his life to pancreatic cancer. The entire family had a history of a very weak pancreas. His father was a renal cell carcinoma patient, and after 2 days, and the patient's condition deteriorating extremely fast within 2 days. The creatinine level went up to 8.1, and he went into a semi-comatose condition where immediate intubation was done. The patient's family decided to airlift him, but he was not in the condition to be airlifted, and he was shifted to another hospital, a bigger hospital, and where under ventilation, he was done something called slate dialysis, and a very slow procedure of dialysis, which started in the afternoon at 2, which ended at night 11:30, because his body was not in a condition where he could take up dialysis, but there was no other option. That was the calculated risk taken to make him survive. And uh, very next day, patient's condition improved drastically, and within 2 days, he was out of ventilator and absolutely fine. And after 2 days, once the dialysis was over, and after 2 days, once he was out of the ventilator, his temperature, which was always around 96, 97, so he was not even having fever, but his calcitonin level was somewhere around 13, which was suggestive of septicemia. But his immunity had gone down so much and his nourishment level was so low that all his B6, B12, his D3, everything was very low. And rest of the blood work was just like how it should be for a 45-year-old. Everything else was normal except for the nourishment part. And then after 2 days, once he was out of the ventilator, he had a temperature of 100 and somewhere always lingering between 104, 105, very high hyperpyrexia fever. And the calcitonin level started dropping once he was put on good antibiotics. By the time his antibiotic reports came, the clonidine, the medicine that was given, uh, uh, the antibiotic that was given for his septicemia affected his kidneys once again. And this time, within 8 hours, again, he was back on ventilator. And he remained on ventilator for the rest of the 3 months that he survived. And throughout those 3 months, there were episodes of delirium, coma, semi-coma conditions. And there were episodes of 100% coherent behavior. He could absolutely understand what was going on around him. And he kept on resisting the physical restraints that were being done to him, because he tried to pull out his nasogastric tube. He found it very irritating. And the family always kept consenting for the physical restraints because they thought they were doing him good. He kept on insisting he didn't like the ICU environment from day one. He wanted to go back home and stay in clean sheets. He knew his family would take better care of him, and his complaints in the ICU were not listened to. None of the nursing staff were, I would say most of the nursing staff were very impatient with him because he used to sleep early in the evening around 7 and wake up by 2 or 3 at night. And at that time, he constantly kept calling out to the nurses, and he was very sure that his wife would be outside waiting to talk to him. And he just kept insisting that she should be allowed inside to talk to him. There were many things he wanted to say. Within 1 week, the condition had deteriorated to an extent where uh, he was already on ventilator, so he couldn't speak. And within 1 week, he was in a condition where he had generalized edema due to his renal conditions, due to which he could not even write anything about that he wanted to convey to his family. He could not write about all that he wanted to be done, and he was aware that he will not survive. And being in a family surrounded by doctors, he had about 4 to 5 doctors in the family. Everybody was trying their level best to make him survive. In that battle, his feelings and decisions were not respected, and everything was considered as delirium, though it was not. And after listening to your session, I am even more sure that everything was not delirium. There were moments when he was very comprehensive in his thinking pattern, very coherent, because his wife, when she used to meet him in the visiting hours, and later on the doctors had given her consent to meet him as often as possible. So she used to ask him questions like, where did you place the order for your new classes? And he used to say lens cut. She could read his lips. So he used to say lens cut, and he remembered the amount he paid for it and what is the remaining amount, balance amount to be paid while collecting the classes. All these kind of information, everything. He knew where he was. He knew whether he has been shifted from one city to another. He was aware who was his treating doctor. He was aware if the nursing staff are good to him or bad to him. He used to tell to his family members. So these kind of things do occur, and I think this should be, this delirium and this physical restraint thing should be very rigidly, legally these things should be stopped. And whenever there is a patient who's about to die, his opinions and feelings and decisions should be respected, and this thing should be conveyed in a very, very categorical manner to all the intensivists in the city, because everybody is not in palliative care. Very few people are, but when they are ICU people, most of the anesthetists are working in the ICU, and these concepts should be very clear. And they will be more clear if there are very serious legal decisions made in this field. And please correct me if I'm wrong and if I'm being emotional over it. And please pardon me and excuse me for the same. Thank you.
Not at all, Dr. Ujjwal. I think your story has actually, given us the worst possible shivers than anything could actually today, because you've narrated something which is extremely private to you, and I just don't have words to express my deepest concerns for whatever has happened. And whatever has happened, I think it's happening day in and day out in every ICU of every hospital in every city or every small town. I think all we can hope is, that there is going to be a change very soon. Uh, Palliative care cannot be, cannot be a one man's work. Has to be a kind of a word of the mouth. People need to be sensitive. And my experience says that, if you have suffered something, you will understand the suffering that the other person is going through. And I think everybody is actually going through some kind of suffering in one point of life. I think we need to hold hands together at this point of time. And we are really privileged that you chose to share these very private things with all of us. We're extremely privileged. Dr. Megha?
Yeah, I can understand. So thank you so much, Dr. Bora, for just telling everything in a concise way. And Dr. Ujjwal, yes, I think it's difficult to go through such things and even witness such things. For us, even witnessing such things is so touching and difficult. So yeah. So let us just try and keep working. As I said, persistence is all that we need to be in our fields and just do that. And another thing I want to add, thank you, Dr. Babita, for telling us about chlorpromazine. So I just went through a little bit about, it's actually a phenothiazine and chlorpromazine, and it is useful in low doses in our in delirium too. Thank you, Dr. Babita, for adding that. And Dr. Babita has also told about EEG and lumbar puncture, of course. Thank you, to rule out any seizures, and lumbar puncture to rule out leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. And it may be appropriate to rule out brain involvement if imaging procedures are not immediately available. Thank you. Closing remarks by you, Dr. Bora.
I think we have really had a very good discussion after this session, and I'm sure that people are taking away good lessons from today's presentation on delirium, as well as the story that has been shared by Dr. Ujjwal, because this is what she has personally gone through. And I'm sure when we again go for our hospital rounds tomorrow, and we are going to actually correct ourselves when we take care of our patients. And that's the only thing that I can hope for and wish for everybody. Thank you so much. Over to you, Shri Priya, for closing this session.
Thank you, Dr. Sanghamitra. Thank you, Dr. Megha, for your valuable time. We do understand your busy schedule and you found out time for this cohort. Thank you so much for that. And special thanks to Dr. Ujjwal for sharing thoughts, because even myself being a non-medical person could feel what the family might have gone through. Whenever we are saying about palliative care, we say about the caregivers as well. And so that feeling is what touched me a lot, apart from the patient's condition. So thank you, Dr. Ujjwal, for that. And with that note, we are winding up today's session. Please don't forget to leave your feedbacks. And I had given one update in the WhatsApp group as well. Request everyone to go through that as well. And with that note, this is Sri Priya signing off from the Tips Echo desk. See you in the next session. Till then, everyone take care. Be safe, be happy. Be
Thanks,
healthy.
everyone. Bye.